It is Thursday, September 29th, 2022, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. I am Wallace Smith. I'm here with my co-host, Mr. John Robinson. Hello, Mr. Robinson.
Good afternoon.
And we have a special guest, returning guest at our request. Let me make that very clear. Mr. Robinson and I sought him out, tracked him down, and dragged him to be here. And very grateful that he is. We have our special guest, the director of the Living Education Program for the Living Church of God, Mr. Jonathan McNair. Mr. McNair, how are you?
Fine, thank you. Good afternoon.
You bet. All right, Mr. Robinson, what is our topic today?
We have a question that's been submitted by a young listener, a young adult, married young adult in the church. And she asked the question, how do you choose a profession that isn't potentially going to make you compromise with your Christian values?
That sounds worthwhile. Let's get after it. Thank you, Jake and Julia, and welcome back, everybody. We are particularly excited about this topic, and I do want to highlight again, it is a real delight to have Mr. Jonathan McNair in the studio. The studio being Mr. Robinson's office, but in the studio again to be able to talk with us. In particular, I wanted him to be able to address this because that is what Living Education is very much about, trying to make sure that young individuals in the church are grounded in the truth of God as they go out into the world. Mr. McNair, before we get started, it's a new year. This is September. The year it's definitely off to a start. How is this year of Living Education going so far? How are things going?
Real well. And actually, when you posed the question, or when Mr. Robinson posed the question to me earlier today, it piqued my interest because this is the type of thing that we really do with our students. We challenge them to think about real life issues. When they come here, it's not just a matter of learning, to memorize parts of the Bible or something. It's actually applying the Bible to real life situations, and the Bible it's a timeless document. So therefore, our wrestle is to wrestle the meaning out of it and how it applies to what we're doing today. So that's why when this question came up, I thought, this is exactly the type of thing we're working with our students about.
Excellent, because it is easy to fall into the trap of thinking that somehow studying your Bible is just an academic pursuit, when it's not. It's about how in the world you live your life day by day, and Living Education is meant to be that, a living education to help young people be able to do that.
One of the things that I like to do sometimes is challenge even the language we use. So, for example, sometimes you hear people talk about their prayer life. How's your prayer life going? And I know what they mean. What they mean is, are you praying, and what are you able to pray regularly and in a meaningful way and all that? But I always sort of do a double take, because so is your prayer life somehow different than your real life? I mean, how does that work? I mean, are there multiple, this is a multiple personality thing. So in reality, you don't have a prayer life in a real life. It's the same. And so, it is our life and how we apply the things of God.
All right, very nice. Well, good. Then all the more we are delighted to have you. Mr. Robinson, would you do us a favor and remind us again of the question? And then we had actually an interesting comment from someone that you collected for us.
Right. Well, the question again was, how do you choose a profession that isn't potentially going to make you compromise with your Christian values? Now, I would argue that was a challenge at all times and every age with every job, certainly, but it's gotten more and more difficult. And so I went to our very own Ben Graham here in our department, who worked for, I was trying to think of how long, somewhere in the neighborhood of around 6 years at a company. And I knew that his company over time had really started to push the more progressive ideas that are out there in the world. And it was a battle for him. So he wrote up a little explanation of his experience at his company, and I thought we would just read it to everyone to set a little more context for how this could actually transpire, especially here at the end of the age, in particular with the direction culture's gone.
Right, and part of the context being important is he does UX and UI work, user experience and user interface. So part of his job was to help design websites to serve their customers and to help the customers, at least ostensibly, achieve their goals financially, et cetera. So,
right,
okay.
Exactly. So Mr. Graham, in his own words, I worked for a company that was bought by a bank. It was fascinating to see how the new regime would alter the work we were dedicated to. At first, it didn't seem like much had changed. The product we were responsible for was a brand new line of business for the new company. It was in investing. However, despite how many of the people that he worked with stuck around, the goals changed dramatically and the product took a backseat to the new management initiatives that had more to do with inclusion and less to do with any actual investing. User experience and user design, if executed properly, should already consider different types of users' needs. Graphic design, which should be about what we can offer to our customers, didn't focus much, if any, to do with learning about investing. Gender and sexual orientation mattered more than actually helping our customers make sound financial decisions. Everyone has different aspects of their jobs, different people they have to work with, so things like these are not always equal. At different times in my career, I may have had to work with someone who was a homosexual without much of a difference in my work. However, as time went on, I'm seeing a larger aspect of the work being dedicated to the gay agenda, and at that time it certainly became a problem. I was able to dodge working on 2 gay pride-related graphic designs, eventually leaving before having to do a third refusal. By then I had already determined that if I was comfortable with refusing politely and letting the chips fall where they may. He says now that he feels blessed to work at a job, because since he works here at headquarters, where I don't need to be faced with a decision regarding this. However, no doubt it's going to become more and more common for others who work in a corporate environment regarding progressive tendencies. I say do what you can to do the best at your job. If the day ever comes where they ask you to do something that goes against your principles, be kind and respectful about it. But in the end, if you lose your job because of your stand, you know that you've made the right choice, and I'm willing to bet you'll find a different job that offers even better priorities and fulfilling work.
So his company was supposed to be about educating their investors about how to invest and earn more on their deposits, et cetera. And instead it was more about how to serve a particular agenda, focusing on the alternate lifestyles, quote unquote, of the customers. And then he was being pressed to use his skills to actually create graphics for the gay pride movement, and that's kind of the big thing. It's interesting. You look at these companies in Saudi Arabia; they don't advertise a big connection to homosexuality, but here in the U.S., of course they will. Thank you for harvesting that from him, Mr. Robinson. And Mr. McNair, you mentioned before we started that you had some friends with a personal experience in some way, right?
Yeah, actually, as we're talking here, it occurred to me that there's another scenario, even in addition to the one I was mentioning to you, where I had a friend from college who was fired from their job because they were a professor in college, and they used the name of a student before they, quote, transitioned. As a result of them using their pre-transition name, they were called on the carpet for it. Now, I say transition. In other words, this is a girl in the class who now considered herself a boy and had a different name that she'd assigned herself. But on the roster, when this friend of mine, when she called her name, or its name, however you want to say it, it was the previous name. And so, anyway, I guess it's the dead naming, or what's the
they call it dead naming. That's naming. Right. So she was using the girl's name, that her given name that her parents gave her, instead of the manly name or whatever.
And it was still on the on the roster, so it wasn't her fault. She knew, and she was trying to be careful because of this issue, but it ultimately led to her being fired.
Wow.
There was another scenario. Actually, this is a couple of years ago. I know someone locally who was working at a pastry and coffee shop. And in that environment, they were beginning to have those who were transitioning and this type of thing, even homosexual elements there. And it was a challenge because the management was very, very strong about making sure that you don't use him or her inappropriately.
Really?
So it's something that is becoming a real challenge for our young people in particular, who are just entering the job force and don't have maybe the experience or the ability to,
and that can be very intimidating.
Sure. So it's certainly a real thing.
Not only is it, and I don't want to distract from our topic too much, but I have been thinking that even if we have parents whose children are in school, and some of our teens could be listening or in high school, and they're going to be under pressure when the teachers and the school system is saying, hey, I know this individual, presented as a boy last year, but now she is presenting as a girl, and all of you need to use this name. That parents need to be ready for that, because you're going to have in the schools those things happen, and surely already are.
You mentioned school. This friend of mine from college who was teaching in college in Kansas. What they said was that now if I understand correctly, if I understand their story, is it's becoming it's being pushed so hard that they're in her state. If let's say in middle school, some young boy or girl says they're transitioning and they're going to be the other gender, what happens is it's like everything is put on hold. The State Department of Education has a team that goes in to sit with administrators and students and make sure that this young person is assisted in their transition, and literally the school has to go through some lectures and education so they can help. So what you say is correct. It's not just in a job situation. It's in schools. It's across the board.
We have a variety of thoughts, and we haven't actually structured a lot of this in terms of which thoughts we'll bring up first. But let me invite Mr. Robinson. I've been monologuing. Any thoughts in particular in answer to this young woman's question?
I do have some thoughts. In fact, hopefully this will expand the topic a little bit, because, I suspect everybody has some awareness that it's trickier than ever to navigate through, especially larger companies that do have a progressive influence to them. But what I was going to share with our audience was there was some point in my mid-20s, when I was really ramping up to, I'd gotten married, and boy, I needed to have a career and take care of my wife and a family. I mean, I had a job. Don't get me the wrong way. I had a job, and I worked in printing. But there was a real realization that hit me one day that not every profession was open to me. That there's a lot of professions that people are commonly in, but the more I thought about it, I thought, boy, I couldn't work in that particular, what's the word?
Field?
Yeah, field. Thank you. And one of the first things that popped into my head, not that I had any real desire to do this, but if I lived in Vegas and I could get a job making a lot of money at the
in a casino.
Can't say counting cards. I think that's frowned upon. But I can't work in a casino as a dealer, because even if I'm not technically doing anything wrong, I am working for a apparatus that's entire money-making ability is based on something that we would never do, the whole gambling kind of concept. And then I even expanded that into other things, and I realized, when we were growing up, they were still saying you can be a doctor or a fireman or a policeman. These were noble professions. And I thought, I could never be. I think part of this was triggered because I had a friend who quit. He made a six-figure income as a graphic designer, because as he was approaching 30, what he really wanted to be was a fireman. So he quit his job. He went, and because 30 was the cutoff, so he went through all the testing, got a job as a fireman, and that's what he did the rest of his life. And it seemed, I liked the concept of being a fireman, but the way they worked was you worked 24 hours on as one shift, and then you had 2 days off, and you don't have to be a math expert to realize you're going to hit the Sabbath every once in a while. And so then Sabbath is always going to be a problem if that's the way they do it, because every so often, you would, for years, need somebody to cover your shift every single time and juggle it around. And so that just didn't seem feasible to me. But then Mr. Smith said that there was a point at which he thought that you guys had done some volunteer work. And I kind of thought it'd be interesting to hear how you navigated doing something like that.
I had always wanted to work as a firefighter, and as well as a smoke jumper,
Smoke jumper? What in the world?
You don't know smoke jumpers?
No, I don't.
You guys
I'm with you. That would be a
jumpers?
cool job. No, I know.
Either that or a gym teacher. I thought every young guy was gym teacher, or smoke jumper, or firefighter. That's it. But
Okay, googling smoke jumper.
Well, they're like the Navy SEAls of forest fire fighters. Guys.
Really?
They parachute in. Do they always parachute? They don't necessarily always parachute in, but they could potentially be.
Okay, I get it.
Right. But when we were in Louisiana, I had an opportunity to work as a volunteer firefighter, and it happened one day when I guess they were doing some sort of a fun drive or something, and bumped into the captain, and he said, oh, we really need help, and etc. And so I said, well, maybe I'll do this. So for a number of years, I worked as a volunteer firefighter. Of course, in that situation, it didn't affect the Sabbath because when it came to the Sabbath, I just wasn't available. I mean, that's the whole deal with a volunteer scenario.
Right.
And so I was able to work around it. And I also felt like, realistically, I mean, there were, I don't know, once or twice, I think once or twice over a few years that there was a call, because we dealt with motor vehicle accidents as well.
Wow.
You're dealing with, in fact, probably half of our calls were accidents.
Really?
Really, I mean, some really bad accidents because we live near a highway. And but what I was going to say is that, if it were a Friday evening, let's say, for example, or a Sabbath morning, usually on the Sabbath, I was gone all day for different congregations, but for Friday evening would be more of a, particularly a scenario that might apply. If your neighbor's house was on fire, would you say, sorry,
Right.
it's the Sabbath, I'm not going to help? Or would you grab a hose and start spraying water? I mean, if there was an accident in front of your house in the middle of the night on Saturday evening, would you say, sorry, it's my Sabbath, hope somebody else helps out? And I felt like if it would come to it and I was home and there was a need, would I actually go to an emergency situation? I would have done it. And at first opportunity, when things were under control, I would have left. But I just felt like, no, at the same time, do I stand there waiting for a call to happen? Of course not.
Right.
So in other words, I felt like it was something I could do, frankly, because of my schedule. I might be able to help when others couldn't because I had a little more flexibility. But that was a volunteer scenario. And so
It wasn't a part of this 24 on, 48
Right.
off, where you're kind of a regular, this is your profession and you're doing this, right?
And I know somebody who's in a situation who wanted to be a firefighter and had to deal with that, and it was really volunteer or they couldn't do it as a regular job. But there's something about that I'd like to at least give at some point, but I'll pass the microphone back to somebody else if you want to add on it.
Well, I was just going to comment that I appreciate the idea. We were talking before this about just the mere fact of being a Christian definitely closes certain doors to you. And it's not that those professions are always evil. Like I tend to go, oh yeah, well, prostitution, definitely out, right? That's not something you could do. But there's nothing evil about being a firefighter, or I would add, for instance, a policeman. We talk about that, in terms of, I'm glad that police exist, given the way the world is situated, right? I'm not saying it's arranged the way it should be. I'm glad that there's individuals whose job is to try to keep us safe. But that said, if one of my sons came to me and wanted to be a police officer, I'd have to say, I don't know, you'd have to be committing to a job where they're going to say part of your job may be to kill other people. And just like the prophets of Israel had a particular role to play, that role prevented them from being able to do some other things. And right, our calling, our lives as Christians is certainly going to just completely close some doors.
Well, a couple other professions I thought of along those lines as we try to close out this point. Think about being a sales rep. Is being a sales rep okay or not? Well, kind of depends on how you go about it and what you're selling.
Right.
You get into advertising again, which kind of touches on what Ben commented on. What happens if your boss comes to you and asks you to do a promotion that you're in charge of for something that that you're uncomfortable with, or just flat out is against your morals and ethics? And I even thought even further about the ethics of selling something that you don't actually believe in, but because that's your job. Well, I actually don't think this is a great product. It just all the little ways in which you're quickly having to evaluate your profession. Is this really a good thing for me to be working on or even profiting from?
There are so many scenarios like that. If you think about it, though, if you work in avionics development, for example, there is a very good likelihood that your work is going to go into the defense industry.
Right.
What about if you're a waiter? If you're a waiter or a waitress, is it okay to serve somebody bacon and eggs?
Right.
Our world, it's a challenging thing because to your point, at what point do we say I cannot be involved in that, that job, versus I realize that I live in a world in which I'm going to be interacting with all kinds of things that are not in accordance with God's way.
Right.
Challenging scenario.
So
Yeah, it is.
So to helpfully cap this off for everybody, you're going to have to make your own judgment when you get out there.
Did we nail that down?
We nailed that down.
But I think if we did, in a sense, it's a broad warning
Right.
that
Yeah.
don't imagine, because there's a specific word in the question, something like
Compromise.
Well, no, it's before that. What do we skip through the
Let's
question
see,
again?
Potentially going to make you compromise.
Oh yeah, potentially is a big word. I don't think you can pick almost any profession where there might
Right.
not be some avenue all of a sudden where a compromise sneaks in. So I think if you're looking for a perfectly safe job, you're going to have to go to a different planet. Not on planet Earth. I don't know if you're gonna find one.
To me, you start with immediate. I mean, there are just professions you can immediately eliminate. So then you're pared down to other ones that you can work with, and then after that, you just have to evaluate the challenges. And I think sometimes you could get into it. It's possible you're going to get into a job or a career, and after a while realize, boy, I can't keep doing this. I feel like I'm being pressured to compromise all the time, and you'll have to do something else. I have one example of that, Mr. Smith. I don't know if you know about this. So we go to the Whole Foods that I go to. Mr. Smith's oldest son Jonathan works there, and he's been over in the pizza department. And so we haven't been getting pizzas there lately, but we did recently. And when I went up to him and I see him, and I know he's gonna be the pizza guy, and I come up to him and I say, yeah, we want to get a whole pizza. And he said, yeah, okay, what do you want on it? And I said, we just want a pepperoni and cheese pizza. And he pauses for a second, and then he goes, I'm sorry, I can't make that pizza for you. So he held up and did his part and was not willing to compromise.
I think he was protecting you there. That's right.
It would have been funny if he would say, do you really want that?
That's right.
You said, yes. Do you really want that? I've heard of that during the days of unleavened bread, where you have maybe a husband and wife go out to eat, and the husband orders a hamburger, and the wife's with the waiter standing there. She says, "Do you really want that?" And he says, "Yes, I do."
It sounds so good. You have no idea.
No, you don't.
Well, good that he recognized, because I think he does have to make those as a course, of what he does. But I'm glad he protected your integrity.
Just make sure you wear for other people where that's not a problem. Just wear your gloves.
Oh yeah, he's good about that. So.
I'd like to turn this on its head a little bit. Okay?
Sure,
let's
do it.
This may completely damage the whole discussion here but I'd like to turn it on its head a little bit and see what you guys think about this.
Okay.
And that's this, in a sense, our way of thinking is so conditioned by I don't know, what would you call the atmosphere, even guidance counseling and all that in high school. I don't know if you guys, this was the same with you, but I found that in high school, it was, I don't know, sophomore, junior year, they're already pushing you to decide on a career. And to think about it, there are, let's just say, for example, I think the firefighter example for me, there are skills. If a person thinks instead of a career, instead they think, what are the skills and aptitudes that I'm good at and that fire me up and give me a passion for life. And let's say, for example, accounting. If you love numbers and you love accounting, it doesn't mean that you have to work for an accounting company, because you could work, let's say, for example, but you like being in the outdoors. I mean, you can work for a construction company. You can work for, an ag service of some type and work with numbers. And so I think this is, in fact, it somewhat, to some degree, it frustrates me, because when we talk with young people sometimes, they're thinking career as opposed to skill. If you have good skills in a given area, you literally can take those skills into different careers, and frankly, even especially as a woman, be able to exercise those skills within your family in a way that really functions according to a godly way. So I think sometimes our young people they're sort of channeled into this career thing. I was able to do something I love to do, and with the firefighting part, and yet I was able to fulfill that while still being able to serve in the ministry. So I just want to add that to the mix as part of really coaching for our young people.
Yeah, as we were doing a little bit of show prep, little minimal show prep today on this one, but as we did, that was one of the thoughts I had, that it's not the same as narrowing your career choices or job choices or what you're doing, but it is something that if you take this mindset in, that whatever you're doing, I want to develop skills for two reasons. One, the more skilled I am, the less likely I am to be let go, only because people don't want to fire the cash cow. They don't want to fire the one who's really serving the company. But then also, if you do have to be let go because you won't compromise your standards, well, you have skills that you'll be able to take someplace else, and it keeps your options far more open than it would for so many others.
I remember there were two different instances where our two different companies I worked for, and both got into some financial trouble, and there was the possibility they were going to be bought by a new group, and then you start thinking, the new group, and what if they fire people and everything? And after one day, I hope I have some credibility with this. I'm slow to draw this conclusion, but one day I finally thought, what am I worried about? Most of my other coworkers are worthless. I'm one of the more knowledgeable, productive people here, and I never worried about it again, because at that point in my career in printing, I did know what I was doing, and I was good at what I did, and so it just gave me a peace of mind that I had developed the tools and and developed the experience. Do you develop experience? Gained the experience. And they gave me a great peace of mind. I wasn't worried about finding another job.
Good, exactly. And Mr. McNair, you said something a while ago that does trigger one of my points. So I'll let us transition to that. I'd like to encourage all of our listeners, our teens and our young adults, that one, this is a good question, but there's a couple things you need to have really going into it. And one of those I'll save for later if we have the time. But I would like to say this, in terms of your Christian values, make sure you have your priorities right. The world doesn't teach you right priorities. Even way back when my wife was young and in school, the teacher asked.
Hold on a second. Did you say way back when your wife was young and in school? Are you going to edit that out of this podcast?
You're breaking up. You're breaking up, Mr. McNair. You're breaking up. Let me just say.
Oh, sorry to interrupt your thought, but I just thought. I hope your wife doesn't listen to this, does she?
Let me say, only right before we got married, when she was still in school. Anyway, she was in elementary school. I think it was elementary school. But her teacher asked, "Well, what do you all want to be when you grow up?" And my wife was up front. I want to be a wife and a mother. That was the main thing she wanted. And this, not that was that long ago, but the teacher frankly ridiculed that. I mean, literally, explicitly, and said, well, is that all? I mean, what else do you want? Like that somehow is not an amazing goal.
As if you're wasting your potential.
Exactly. And it's just such an ungodly attitude. And so to all of our teens and our young adults, one of the 7 laws of success is to set the right goal. And of course, in your life, you've got multiple goals. You don't just have one goal in your whole life. You have many goals. And so at the top of that needs to be that you're seeking after the kingdom, right? You're seeking to fulfill what God desires of you as a Christian. But I would say definitely above job goals, those kinds of goals, has to be, depending on if you're a man or a woman, I want to strive one day to be a godly husband, a godly wife, a godly father, and a godly mother. That set those first, because that does determine so much about the rest, and that also will narrow so much of what you do. For our younger female listeners, you might want to consider, well, do I want to invest, even if something doesn't seem naturally, it's going to cause me to want to compromise spiritually in terms of what I think of as Christian values, but is it something that you're going to invest a lot of time and money in that you wouldn't see getting any results out of that in a career, say for 20, 30 years, when really you might get married shortly after that, and then do you want to be invested in some kind of career that's going to take you away from a husband and for children for decades and decades? Or do you want to, like Mr. McNair was saying, acquire a certain set of skills that if you do end up finding the right person, you end up marrying a fellow Christian, and you can change gears, and you do want to be a wife and a mother, and you can bring skills to that as well, right? We have to set our priorities for men. It's not just about following your passion. It's making sure you will be able to support a family as best you can. I know for myself, it was heartbreaking to me. And I don't think I've told the story in the podcast, but I think I have in sermons, because I wanted to be a high school teacher from, I think, my junior high days. I loved math because it's the most passionate subject in the world. Well, no, spiritual things.
Firefighting.
Right after firefighting. And I wanted to teach math. And then whenever we had our first son, or I say we were pregnant with our first son, my wife lost the weight and I didn't. But Jonathan was coming along into the world. And I had to realize for us to do our plan, which was that my wife would be able to stay home so she could frankly work harder in the home than she ever has outside of the home, to rear those children and to bring them up, in a godly way, in a way that a wife at home can do, then I was going to have to change jobs. On a Texas teacher salary, I just couldn't afford to do that. And I tell you, it broke my heart. I will admit, I actually had tears in my eyes when I went in to resign that summer to give them enough time to find another teacher. Now, actually, God blessed me with a great job after that. And the first paycheck I got that wasn't a teacher's paycheck, I felt a lot better, all of a sudden. But at the same time, that I never thought I'd have to burn that bridge, but I did. I had to do that because I had a more important goal. I wanted to be the kind of father and husband that I felt God wanted me to be. And I wish I could say that I've always made choices that clear, but I'm so grateful that God made that clear to me. And so for our teens and young adults, I just want to emphasize that you've got to set certain goals before whatever job you might want to do, and think ahead. You're not too young to be thinking, what do I need to be doing in my life now to prepare to be a good dad, or prepare to be a good mom, or to be able to, what kind of skills should I begin trying to acquire that will put me in a place where I can support a family and I can be a good mom to my children. So I want to highlight that. Don't just think of, say, not compromising on the Sabbath or not compromising in terms of various aspects of the truth, but also think larger, not compromising on the higher roles that God would desire for you to play in life.
The job that and I'm speaking now as men, for our guys, the job that we have has a number of facets, not just compromising on our obedience to God, and
right,
like we're beginning with, but like you said, it has to do with, are we going to be able to be, as a husband, are we going to be able to take care of our family? I think that, if a man would say, well, look, I'm doing something that is, I'm not compromising in terms of some of the agendas of today, but yet I'm working 80 hours a week, gone all the way from home, so my children don't even know me. But that's okay because I'm not compromising on transgenderism.
Right.
Well, that's crazy. This is, in a sense, the question is really a facet of really a bigger question, and that is that discerning how our work home balance should really fulfill the godly values and godly instructions for a father and for a mother.
I couldn't. Go ahead.
No, you go right ahead, Mr. Robinson.
I couldn't agree more, and I'm really glad that you brought that out, because I was going to say something similar, and then I had my own experience in this, which was, again, in going back to some of our original comments about there's some professions you just can't be involved in, and one of the things I was going to say is another limiting factor is, again, speaking as men, is one where you get into a Fortune 500 company maybe, and you grind out the next 30 years working 78 hours a week, and your kids don't see you. I thought the same thing. Yeah. When Maddie was born, a newborn, I had an opportunity in a new job, and I was kind of glad because I needed to make more money. I wasn't making enough money to. Audrey had stopped working. We were in our new home, and I was trying to figure out how to make more money. Well, a good job opportunity came up. But the problem was they made it was quite clear. It was obvious I was going to be expected to work 50 to 60 hours a week and sometimes travel. And as much as we needed the money, I turned the job down. I had the job. I turned it down because I was not going to miss my daughter, my brand new daughter, and not be around for her. And maybe I could have done some things. Maybe it would have worked out different than I thought, but I wasn't willing to take that chance. And at least at that moment, it was very important to me, and I felt like I prioritized my family. And I do think 22 years later,
probably glad for it.
Exactly. No regrets.
Yeah, I got such good advice from it was not an individual in the church at the time, but I was struggling with this situation. I was trying to think, how can I as a teacher do this? Remain a high school teacher, and yet somehow still enable my wife to be able to quit her outside of the home work, to be able to work at home as a wife and a mother. And like, I thought, well, I could get a second job. Maybe I could work 2 jobs. But that was, I can't remember, it was my wife who first said it, that I don't want you coming home and having the kids say, oh, look, Uncle Daddy is home, because they never see you. You know, that doesn't really work. And I really, at the time, I couldn't even fathom not being a high school teacher. And it was actually this fella. He was a ex-Marine. He was older than I, but a good friend, and I would say a mentor to a certain extent. And he knew what I was going through and trying to figure things out. And he told me, and I'll never forget it. I'll be grateful, till the day I die. Speaking of my students and such, he said, Wally, anybody can teach those kids math. Only you can be a father to that son that's on the way. And I thought, that's absolutely right. God has actually appointed you, as me in that case, as this kid's father and my wife's husband. Nobody else can fill that role. I'm not such a great math teacher that they couldn't hire someone to be able to fill that role.
Jaime Escalante, they could have brought him in.
Well, it did remind me of a scripture in 1 Timothy chapter 5, and it's a little bit different application perhaps, but in verse 8 there was where Paul is kind of warning everyone. He says, if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for the household, especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. And I understand there are definitely special circumstances. You have husbands who have had a catastrophic injury of some sort. And we're not trying to talk about those sort of circumstances. We're talking about those of you who are right now teens and young adults who are looking at your future and trying to plan for that future. And we're saying you need to consider these higher priorities that will be expected of you under God, because that's also a matter of not compromising. There are a lot of men, and I honestly could easily fall into this temptation when I was teaching. It was very time intensive, and even in the ministry we can fall into these temptations to kind of sacrifice our family on the altar of whatever work we're doing. But at the same time, not compromising with God's way, putting your family and being in a right relationship to your responsibilities to your family, that is something that you don't want to compromise with. And there are a lot of men that do. Well, I'm putting food on the table. We're putting food on the table. That we appreciate that. Thank you. But at the same time, we never see you. Your children don't get to hear your words of wisdom, if you will. They don't get to see your example as a man. And of course, we're kind of talking more as men, because best I can tell, we are. All 3 of us are men. But that was one thing that one of the points I wanted to make today.
I think it's interesting how you brought out the fact that certainly we need to encourage our young guys to get the skill, get the training. Don't waste these years playing video games. Instead, get the training that will allow you to be successful, really successful. It opens up options for you. But, I appreciate that you were willing to sacrifice your desire, for the benefit of helping your wife to fulfill the biblical role of a mother in the home. I think that's interesting because years ago, Mr. Weston and I at an L4T, we were going through different men's and women's roles topics, and I had the shock of my life because we did this little questionnaire. We said, how many of you young ladies really desire to be a mother, wife, certainly fulfill your potential, develop skills, all those things that you can do as a wife and a mother, without being chained to a 9-to-5, frankly. But how many of you young ladies really see that as something you desire? Almost all. I mean, we had about 30 young adults there. About half and half.
What was the age range?
This is 18 to 30. So young
adults.
L4T. But here's what surprised me. I expected in this day and age, you think, oh well, some of the young, maybe this is negative thinking on my part. Our young ladies are conditioned to think that if they're going to be successful, it has to be career oriented.
Right.
And so I expected, maybe there'd be some of them who would say, maybe half, who would say, yes, I'd like to do that. Almost everyone.
Wow.
But you know what? The same question was asked of the guys. And you know what we found out? Most of the guys wanted their wife to be out working.
Really?
And I was absolutely dumbfounded because to me, I thought it'd be the other way around.
Yeah.
And when we started to get into it, which was why we were doing this, to really discuss and help our young people to face these challenges and think about them as opposed to being lemmings and going over the cliff with society. But what it came out of it was because they saw the money. They saw, well, my wife is working, it's going to be a bigger income for our family. We're going to be more comfortable. I'm going to be able to have a bigger TV and a boat and everything else. And we said, guys, you're not thinking smart here.
Right.
Do you really want a wife that is going to have another head? She's going to be going off in another direction, or do you want a wife that's going to be with you and working with you and supporting and all that? So anyway, I thought it does for our young girls to be able to look at the challenges before them, making a decision,
right,
to really be part of a team in the home. It takes a man who is willing to actually encourage her, sometimes by putting aside what he would like for what's best. And isn't that part of being, isn't that
Yes.
what a husband is?
Absolutely.
You have to,
100%.
sometimes as a husband, it's about putting ourselves maybe in our selfish desires or even our real desires.
right.
Sometimes putting those second as a mature decision for what's best for our wife and our family.
100%. What did Christ do for the bride, right? He actually allowed himself so far as getting crucified. He actually put that much of himself off to the side for the sake of, frankly, all of us is all he had to gain. It's not like he went from being God before to being super God afterwards somehow. He just returned to the glory that he had with the Father before the world was, and it says in John 17. The only thing he had to gain was his bride, was family. That's exactly right. So thank you for putting it that way. Who has another? I've got one more point, but I just used mine because somebody else is in
I'm
there.
still sort of musing on that. I think this is, and again, I'm glad you gave me the opportunity, because this is what, frankly, living education is about, where we're musing and wrestling with these issues.
Kind of real time with the kids. Do you talk about these things?
We do. We really do. So we spend a lot of time thinking about these kinds of issues. So.
Oh, good. And please do give us some feedback too. We've appreciated every email we've gotten. All 2. No, I'm just kidding. We've gotten a few more than that. But
over the one of last week.
the email address does work now. It did not work before, but IT was right on top of it and they fixed it. It's just podcast@livingyouth.org. So podcast@livingyouth.org. So by all means, just feel free and reach out and let us know kind of what you think. If some of these things have gotten you thinking a little bit differently. Frankly, I know we'd love to hear that. So yeah, before I jump on mine, anybody else have another point they were going to make?
I've run out of material.
Have you? I only have one more that I would make, and then I'm definitely open to anything else you guys want to say. And I would say it's a little bit. Again, we've talked before. We've already mentioned you're not going to be able to guarantee that any job out there is not going to ask you to compromise in some kind of way. You can look and you can often see on research jobs online to see what sometimes require a bit of lack of integrity, but these things are spreading all throughout society. Eventually, we know in Revelation it says there's going to be a time when you can't even buy or sell without compromising with the truth. And that's not even a job. That's just trying to actually live life. But one of the things that I would encourage all of our teens and young adults to do is to focus now in this time when you're young on actually grounding yourself on what those values actually are. And that ties in a little bit with what we've just been talking about. This is the time in your youth, so you don't have to pay the mistakes for not having done it later, to ask yourself, well, what are my values? Like, sometimes it could be are your values, like we see in the broader Church of God movement, if you will, for lack of a better term. There are those that say, well, I'm keeping the Sabbath and I'm keeping the holy days, but they have nothing to do with the work. And we talked about that just a couple of podcasts ago, about how vital the work to the world actually is. And they may not see that as compromising with Christian values, but doing the work of preaching the gospel to the world is a value of Jesus Christ that makes it a Christian value, and so that actually is a kind of compromise. This is the time to talk to your parents, to listen in church and dialogue with your pastor, and take the time to establish what those values are. Like some of you listening may not have even thought about, oh yeah, actually being a dad and being a mom, that those are Christian values. This is the time to invest and to try to make sure you're really grounded in what those values are. That's one of the exciting things about Living Education. That's a part and parcel of exactly why it's here, is helping the students who happen to come to the on-campus program to take the time with them to really, in the action, while they're working, they're actually doing a job for half of the day, and then they're in classrooms the other time. There's a variety of activities that are worked in, and definitely it's a lot of fun. But it's a time to help them truly be grounded. And let me add, maybe you're too young yet. You're not old enough to consider Living Education in terms of on campus. But Living Education is more than just on campus. There's online programs as well. There's no reason you can't actually already be involved in investing more in your spiritual education and spiritual life to get those things clear. And I'll add, because you're young, the Bible says foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. And sometimes I feel like that foolishness, how long was I a child? Till 45 or so? I feel like that kind of lasted a long time with me. But I know for myself, it just seems like even every 5 or 7 years, I can look back on the previous 5 or 7 years and think, boy, there's things I know now that I didn't even fully understand then. Don't take for granted that you have those things already all together and you already know what's important, because speaking as someone who's over 50 now, you likely don't. It really is worth investing. Sitting down with your parents, what better thing to do on a Friday night, and ask your parents, Mom and Dad, what's most important to you? What are the things that you would recommend that I look into in my life as I'm trying to get things organized and trying to look down the road to see what I would want to do. So that was one point I definitely want to make sure that I included today. Was one of the best things you can do to try to hedge against future compromise is to get strong now. The Bible says that the ant does its work in the time when the work is to be done, so that when the harsh times come, it's already done its preparation.
Just to echo what you were saying, I was thinking about this, and what is so useful for a young person is to develop discernment. I mean, that's what the Proverbs are all about, is developing wisdom as to how to apply the things they're learning, because you have to learn what are the battles you're going to fight, what hills are you going to stand on, what values, where are you going to take your stand. And if you don't read and study the Bible and learn from the Bible seriously, then you don't know what you're going to stand on, what you have to stand on, and what is an area of subjectivity where God, with the Sabbath, God doesn't dictate every last thing we do on the Sabbath. So we have to learn to develop discernment as to what's appropriate, what's not, and also, frankly, as a young person, our young people do face decisions in terms of keeping the Sabbath and having to deal with maybe a boss or a part-time job, or
right.
A team they're playing on in sports or some type of activity, and those are all really great training opportunities to develop the ability to discern where to draw lines. And so really, in fact, for probably a lot of our young people, I think are already involved in those things, and they're really meaningful and really helpful. And sometimes actually sometimes when we're facing things like that, we make mistakes, and we realize that, I'm not going to do that again. I thought it was okay to do that on the Sabbath, right. But afterwards, man, I realized that was, I don't think so. My conscience, and it's not just my conscience and my feelings, it's God has educating my conscience and letting me know that was not to be done.
Right.
So anyway, it's something that I think our young people are involved in for good, really for good.
Yeah, I want to make sure I paraphrase what you said, because I appreciated that point, that even now we might have some teens that are a part of sports, that in a variety of other activities, and these opportunities are just that. They're opportunities to even practice right now about those things. And anyone trying to do something worthwhile, you're going to make mistakes, but take advantage of those, meditate on those, and recognize them for what they are. Ask for forgiveness whenever it's necessary, and learn now. In fact, it prompts to my mind Christ's comment that he who is faithful in that which is least is also faithful in that which is much. So use those small opportunities at school, in activities that you're a part of, in any clubs you might be doing, any small part-time jobs. Use those opportunities to practice this righteous living and a dedication to God's way. And when the big things come, you can have some confidence you'll be ready for those too. Anybody else? Anybody have something really brilliant to say before we wrap up? Only brilliant. Only brilliant things now. Wow, nothing. We have left it all on the field. That is literally all of our brilliance.
I think we've taken the question and gone, we've gone around in circles with it, but hopefully it's provided food for thought.
Yeah, I think so.
That's the whole point, honestly.
I mean, it raises lots of thoughts in my mind, but it starts to become a different podcast.
Yeah.
We do find in doing our podcast that by the time we're done with one, we've often thought of 2 other podcasts we could do.
Well, one I've had kids ask me a couple different times. Kids, sorry.
I do the same
When you get
thing.
over a certain age, all of a sudden it's all kids. And what's that commercial that's going on right now where you're turning into your parents? There's a whole anyway. God is realistic. Is more realistic about us than we are about ourselves, and the adults can be some that way. Like, for instance, I have to phrase this correctly. The adults are aware when you're younger you're going to make mistakes. God knows you're going to make mistakes. The key is recognizing you've made the mistake and correcting it. I mean, that's the bottom line. And I appreciated your comments because I've done that. I was thinking when I was younger, more than a few times, unfortunately, I did some things on the Sabbath, and later I was like, yeah, that was not. Actually, one time somebody said it to me. It's like, yeah, that's not keeping the Sabbath. I was like,
oh, you're right.
You're right.
It's
not.
Yeah, and it's not an excuse to not try and do the right thing, but that's part of. I remember the first mistake we made like that after we got married, and I won't go into the details about it. My wife and I were trying to balance, because none of my family's in the church, and trying to satisfy them and keep them happy while also, say, not keeping Christmas and other things, and really thought that we had thought it through. She'd probably say, no, you thought it through. You're the head of the household. That's on your head. And so we made certain choices, and afterwards, it was almost immediately afterwards it hit us, that was a bad call. It wasn't for lack of trying.
No,
we were
that's true.
trying to do the right thing. And I like to think that God, definitely recognized that, but we definitely learned from it. And yeah, you're going to find those things. You're going to make mistakes on the job as well. And, just learn from them.
It reminds me of a maxim in lifeguarding. So there's another dream of mine when I was young.
Lifeguarding.
I always wanted to lifeguard, and I got the chance. I did the firefighting in Louisiana. In upstate New York, I was able to do lifeguarding and volunteer, and then do a little part-time, and also teach. So I ended up teaching lifeguarding to high school kids primarily and all. But there's a maxim, and that is that you teach to perfection. In other words, you teach it exactly like it should be, but you test to competence. So in other words, when you're in the pool and you're trying to do a save on someone, and I'm testing them in terms of their lifeguarding skills, I don't demand that they do every step exactly by the book. Your demands are broader, that they get the person to the side of the pool. I mean, because sometimes there are all kinds of variables. The size of the person,
Right.
the condition of the person. If the person has, for example, they hit their head and they're unconscious, you want to get them to the side of the pool. If you do not have the exact right hand position on them, it doesn't matter. You test the competence. And so anyway, it reminds me that's what God does with us. He teaches us by His Word. There is no lack of excellence in terms of His Word, but in our execution, He works with us to become competent in the the living of His way of life. So to me, that's a really important maxim to keep in mind.
Now, that's a great way to put it. I've thought about that principle, a principle like what you just discussed many times. I want to say even Ms. Robinson, I may have even discussed one recently. I've never heard it put that way, and I really appreciate those words.
I love how that framed it. That's such a great example.
Yeah. Well, thank you for coming, Mr. McNair.
Thanks
we know
for the
that
opportunity.
it's a very busy time for you, and we appreciate you taking out that time to come and sit down with us and spend more time than you probably should away from the things that you need to do. And we thank all of you for listening. We hope it has been profitable, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thanks.
Smith and Robinson.